He had exactly $4.63 in his bank account, a 7-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, and a landlord standing at his door who could take everything away with a single phone call. Logan Pierce didn't beg. He didn't lie. He didn't pretend. Instead, he opened his door wider and said the 3 words most men in his position would never say. Come inside. Look. What happened next in that small apartment would change 2 lives in ways neither of them saw coming, and cost both of them something they hadn't planned to give. If this story found you tonight, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The eviction notice had been taped to his door on a Tuesday, which Logan always thought was a particularly cruel day for bad news. Not a Monday, when you were already braced for the world to disappoint you. Not a Friday, when at least you could fall apart over a weekend. A Tuesday, the most forgettable, most ordinary day of the week. And there it was, a white envelope with a bright red border, the kind of envelope that made your stomach drop before you even read a single word. He pulled it off the door slowly, like removing a bandage, and stood in the hallway of the Callaway Arms building, reading it under the flickering fluorescent light that had been broken for 6 weeks. Management hadn't fixed it. Management hadn't fixed a lot of things. The letter was formal and precise. It informed Logan Pierce, tenant of Unit 4C, that his rent balance of $2,460, covering the current month plus a previous partial shortfall, was due in full no later than Friday, the 15th. Failure to remit would result in formal eviction proceedings commencing the following Monday. Today was Thursday the 14th. Logan folded the letter in half, then in half again, then pushed it into the back pocket of his jeans. He stood there another moment before he went inside. The apartment smelled like grilled cheese and crayons. Marigold, his daughter, had eaten dinner an hour ago. Grilled cheese and apple slices, her standing order on school nights, and was now in her room supposedly doing homework, which probably meant she was drawing in the margins of her math worksheets and calling it creative expression. She had started doing that in 2nd grade and showed no signs of stopping. "Dad?" Her voice floated from down the hall before he even got his jacket off. "Yeah, Bug, it's me. There's still 2 apple slices left if you want them. I'll get them in a bit." He hung his jacket on the hook by the door and pressed his back against the wall for a second, eyes closed. He didn't allow himself long. With Marigold awake, he had maybe a 12-minute window where she'd stay occupied before coming to find him, and he needed those 12 minutes to think clearly. The math was not complicated, it was just bad. He'd lost the Hargrove account 3 weeks ago. His biggest client, a mid-sized tech company that had been paying him $2,000 a month for ongoing brand design work. Their new CEO had come in, done the standard assessing our vendor relationships sweep, and Logan had been cut along with 2 other freelancers in the same email. No performance issue, no warning, just a line about streamlining our creative process in-house. He'd read that email standing in the Whole Foods parking lot and had to sit on a curb for 10 minutes before he could drive. Since then, he'd picked up 2 small jobs, a logo for a bakery in Montclair, a pitch deck for a startup that was probably going to fold before they even launched, and made maybe $600 total. He had 3 invoices out that hadn't been paid. One of those clients had stopped returning his calls. His checking account currently held $4.63. He'd verified this 3 times this morning, as though the number might change if he looked at it enough. He thought about calling his sister in Phoenix. He'd done that once before, 2 years ago, when the transmission went out on his car in the same month Marigold got pneumonia, and he'd borrowed $800 that had taken him 14 months to pay back. He didn't want to do that again. Not because of the money, because of the way she'd said, "Of course, Logan," in that voice. The careful, quiet voice that wasn't quite pity, but was close enough to feel the same. He thought about calling his father. Then he didn't think about that anymore. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter eating one of Marigold's leftover apple slices, and he looked at the calendar on the refrigerator, the one she'd decorated with stickers of horses and planets, and he counted the days again, though he already knew the number. Tomorrow was the 15th. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. He lay in the dark and ran through numbers that never added up, made lists in his head of people he could call, favors he could ask, corners he could cut. He thought about the paintings stacked in the 2nd bedroom, The one that was supposed to be a home office, but had gradually become a storage space for canvases, stretched frames, and art supplies that had accumulated over 8 years of working in the margins of his real life. He'd started painting seriously after his divorce. That was how he thought about it. After. He never called it what it actually was, which was after the collapse, or after everything fell apart, or after Claire left and took the good years with her. He just thought of it as the dividing line, and painting had been what he'd found on the other side of it. He was good. He knew he was good. Not in a boastful way, but in the same way a carpenter knows when a joint fits right. It was just true. He painted people mostly, faces and hands and the weight of ordinary moments. He had a show 2 years ago at a small gallery in Hoboken, sold 4 pieces, made enough to cover Marigold's spring break camp, and a new laptop. He'd never really pursued it the way he should have. There was always the design work, the steady, paying, real-world design work that felt like the thing he was actually supposed to be doing, and the painting that felt like something he did when no one was watching. He fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning and dreamed about nothing he could remember. Friday arrived gray and cool, the sky the color of old concrete, and Logan made Marigold's lunch with systematic care, turkey and cheddar, no mustard, the crust cut off because she was 7 and hadn't evolved past the crust stage yet, and walked her to the corner where the school bus stopped. "You look tired," she told him, squinting up at him with that frank, slightly clinical expression she'd developed sometime around age 5 and never abandoned. "I'm fine. You have circles. It's called getting old. You'll understand someday." She considered this. "Ms. Haverford has circles too, but hers are different. Hers are puffy." "Mine are the regular kind," Logan said. "Artistic." Marigold looked unconvinced. She hugged him around the middle. She still did that, still just grabbed him without warning, full body, like she was trying to hold the whole of him in place, and then climbed onto the bus and didn't look back. That was her whole approach to life so far. She grabbed what she loved and then moved on without looking back. And Logan had decided a long time ago that she'd gotten that from someone better than him. He walked back to the apartment. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and the eviction notice unfolded beside it, and he went through his email one more time looking for anything he might have missed. There was nothing he'd missed. He checked the bank account. $4.63. He closed the laptop. For about 20 minutes, he sat with the specific, heavy quiet of a person who has run out of options and is just beginning to understand what that actually feels like. Not panic. He'd been through panic already 3 weeks ago when the Hargrove email landed. This was something older and quieter. It felt like the end of a certain kind of story he'd been telling himself about how things were going to be okay, and the uncertain beginning of a different story he hadn't figured out yet. Then he got up, went to the second bedroom, and started pulling canvases out. He didn't know exactly why. Some instinct, maybe. The same thing that made him check the bank account 3 times. Just some reflex toward the things he actually had instead of the things he needed. He leaned them against the wall in the narrow hallway, and then in the living room, angling them so the light from the windows hit them properly, and he stood back and looked at them. 41 paintings, 8 years of work, accumulated in stacks and leaned against walls and occasionally forgotten and rediscovered. Some of them were early work, uneven, technically clumsy in ways that were still visible to him even now. Some were newer, more controlled. The technique there, but occasionally too careful. And then there were maybe a dozen that were something else entirely. The ones that had come out of some place he couldn't fully explain or manufacture. The ones where he'd looked up from the canvas and realized hours had passed. Among those, 3 in particular. He'd had those 3 appraised 6 months ago, partly out of curiosity and partly because a friend had kept pushing him to, insisting he didn't understand what he had. The appraiser, a thin, serious woman named Dorcas Reeve, who ran a gallery in Chelsea and had the professional manner of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by very little, had looked at the 3 pieces for a long time without speaking. The appraisal values had surprised him, not turned his life around money, not quit everything and moved to Tuscany money, but real money. The kind that made him understand for the first time that what he'd been doing in this room for 8 years wasn't a hobby. He was looking at one of the 3, a painting of a woman at a diner counter seen from behind, her reflection ghostly in the dark window glass in front of her, the whole thing lit by a cold fluorescent blue, when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Ava Sterling. I own the Callaway Arms building. I'll be there at 6 p.m. today regarding your account. Please be home." He read it twice. Then he put the phone down carefully on the coffee table and went to make more coffee, because his first cup had gone cold while he was moving paintings, and some situations required a fresh start. He knew the name. Everyone in the building knew the name. Ava Sterling had bought the Callaway Arms 18 months ago as part of what the local business pages called an urban residential portfolio expansion, which was the kind of language used to describe the process of very wealthy people acquiring the places where ordinary people lived. She owned several buildings in the area, along with, according to various things Logan had half read on his phone at 3 in the morning, a real estate firm, a hospitality group, and some kind of sustainability-focused investment fund. She was 30 years old and had appeared on 2 magazine covers in the past year, which Logan knew because their downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Petrakis, had taped one of them to the hallway bulletin board with the caption, "Our Landlord," written beneath it in red marker, as though this were either a warning or something to be proud of. He had never met her. His lease was managed through a property management company, a place called Meridian Group, and all his communications had been with a rotating cast of indifferent representatives named things like Chad and Brittany, who sent automated reminders and signed their emails with the building's official letterhead. Logan had never needed to go above them, until now, apparently, he had reached a level of financial deficiency that required the actual owner. He cleaned the apartment. He wasn't sure why. Some residual wiring from childhood, maybe, the lesson that you straightened up when company was coming regardless of the circumstances. But he washed the dishes and wiped down the counters and straightened the cushions on the couch. And then he stood in the living room surrounded by 41 paintings and realized he'd created a different problem. The paintings were everywhere. There was nowhere to put them that wasn't in the way of somewhere else. He started moving them back to the second bedroom, then stopped. He left them where they were. If they were going to be the only interesting thing in this conversation, they might as well be visible. He fed Marigold dinner at 5. Actual pasta this time, not grilled cheese, because something about the evening felt like it called for a hot meal, and got her settled in her room with a book and the firm instruction that she was to stay in her room until he came to get her. "Is someone coming?" she asked, already suspicious. "Yes." "Who?" "A woman about the apartment." Marigold processed this. "Is she the landlord?" "Sort of." "Mrs. Petrakis says she's pretty." "Mrs. Petrakis says a lot of things." "Is she mean?" Logan looked at his daughter, at her wide, careful eyes, and the way she was already preparing herself, and something moved in his chest. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Stay in your room, Bug. I'll come get you when it's done." He pulled her door shut and went to the kitchen and stood at the window watching the street below. At 10 minutes to 6, he saw a black car. Not a limousine, just a car, clean and dark and new, pull up to the building entrance. A woman got out. He watched her cross the sidewalk toward the door. She was wearing a charcoal gray coat, her dark hair pulled back, and she walked the way some people do when they're used to being the most competent person in any room they enter. Not fast, not slow, just with a settled kind of intention. She didn't look up at the building. She didn't look around. She already knew where she was going. Logan stepped back from the window. He went to the door and waited for the knock. She knocked twice. Not aggressively, but firmly. The knock of someone who wasn't used to not being answered. He opened the door. Ava Sterling was a few inches shorter than he'd expected, though he couldn't have said what exactly he had expected. She was carrying a leather portfolio, the kind that held documents, not art, and her expression when she looked at him was measured and professional and gave away absolutely nothing. "Mr. Pierce." Not a question. "Ms. Sterling." He stepped back. "Come in." She looked at him for a moment, quick, almost imperceptible, the kind of look that files something away before you finished saying hello, and then stepped inside. He watched her take in the room. She was good at not reacting, but the paintings registered. He saw it in the slight pause, the almost involuntary shift of her eyes across the canvases leaning against every wall. "You've been busy," she said. "That's one word for it." She turned to face him. I came because the balance is significant enough that Meridian flagged it for personal attention. $2,460 due today. Have you spoken to anyone there about a payment plan? Yes. I was told that wasn't available for balances over 90 days. That's correct. Right. He put his hands in his pockets. Do you want to sit down? She looked at the couch, which had two throw pillows on it that Marigold had arranged into what she called a comfort fort, and then at the chair across from it. Sure, she said, and sat in the chair. He sat on the couch. The paintings surrounded them. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of Marigold rustling around in her room. I don't have the money, Logan said. I'm going to tell you that straight because I think it wastes less of your time than if I try to explain my way into making it sound better than it is. I had a major client fall out 3 weeks ago. I have invoices outstanding that haven't been paid, and my account is currently... He paused. Not good. Ava held her portfolio in both hands, not opening it. She was watching him in a way that was hard to read. Not cold, exactly, but contained. How long have you lived here? She asked. 4 years. Any prior late payments in that 4 years? No. Meridian's records would show that. They do. She said it simply, like a fact she'd checked before coming here, which she probably had. You're 4 years in, clean record, and then this. She paused. What kind of design work? Brand identity mostly. Logo systems, brand guidelines, some UX work. I had a long-term client that let me go. Restructuring. He said it the way he'd gotten used to saying it, flat and clear. He wasn't going to dress it up. And the paintings? She glanced toward the canvases. That's a significant body of work. 8 years. Are you represented? No, I had a show a couple years ago. Some sales. I've never really pursued it seriously. He stopped himself. He hadn't come here to pitch his art career to his landlord. I'm not asking you to take them in exchange for the rent, he said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to make this weird. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile, but an opening. Then why are they all out here? I was looking at them this afternoon, before you came. He paused. I don't really have a better explanation than that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned her head and actually looked at the paintings, properly this time, not the quick scan she'd given them when she walked in. She started on the left side of the room and moved her gaze slowly. The portrait of the old man in the hardware store, hands resting on the counter like they'd been there 40 years. The study of 2 kids on a fire escape, summer, the city blooming yellow behind them. The diner window piece he'd been looking at this morning. She stopped at the diner piece. That one, she said quietly. Yeah. Who is she? Nobody specific, or nobody I know personally. I was at a diner in Jersey City about 2 years ago, late, and there was a woman at the counter, just sitting there. Not sad, not happy, just present in the way people sometimes are when they think nobody's watching. I took a photo on my phone and painted it in maybe 4 days. One of those things that just came out. Ava looked at it a long moment, then she turned back to him. What are you proposing, Mr. Pierce? He'd thought about this for the past 4 hours. He turned it over and around and looked at it from every angle, and it still felt strange to say out loud, but it was what he had. 3 of these paintings have been professionally appraised, he said. The appraisals are from Dorcas Reeve at the Meridian Gallery in Chelsea. Not this building's Meridian, different company. And the values are documented. I'm proposing to offer 2 of them as collateral, not a sale. Collateral. I get 60 days to bring my account current, you hold the pieces as security, and if I default, they're yours. He held her gaze. I know it's not standard. I know you don't have to consider it, but I also know that going through formal eviction proceedings costs time and money and doesn't get you the back rent anyway. And I have a 7-year-old daughter who'd be looking for a new school. Ava was quiet, not thinking it over quiet, something else, a different kind of quiet, like she was processing something that hadn't quite arrived yet. How much are they appraised at? She asked finally. The 2 I'm offering, combined value of just under $4,000. And the third? The third I'm not offering. She raised an eyebrow. It's not for sale, he said. And it's not collateral. Some things aren't. He said it without apology. She looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since she'd walked in, she unclenched slightly, something in her shoulders, something around her eyes, and said, "Which one is the third?" Logan stood and moved to the hallway, where he'd leaned the third canvas against the wall, partially obscured by the others, which was partly intentional. He carried it out and set it where the light from the window lamp would hit it. It was a portrait. A woman in her late 50s sitting in a garden, not posed, caught in the middle of something, reaching toward a plant or perhaps just resting her hand on the soil. Her face turned slightly toward the light. She wore no jewelry. Her hair was gray at the temples. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite peace, but was the specific thing that existed somewhere between them, the face of someone who had worked hard and loved hard and was, in this particular moment, simply here. He'd painted it from a photograph he'd found in a box of things his mother left him when she passed. He didn't know who the woman in the original photo was, and he'd changed her enough in the painting that she existed now as her own person, someone assembled from instinct and grief and love. He'd painted it in the worst month of the 2 years after his divorce, when Marigold was still so little she didn't understand what was happening, and he'd needed to put something real onto a canvas before he came apart entirely. He didn't tell Ava Sterling any of this. He just set the painting where she could see it, and he watched her face change. Mum. It happened slowly. She looked at the painting, the way you look at something that reminds you of something before you've identified what the reminder is. A kind of flickering recognition, the brain running a search in the background while the face does its best to stay neutral. Then the neutral left. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tears, or a sharp intake of breath, or any of the things that happen in movies. It was just a softening, a sudden private vulnerability in someone who had clearly spent considerable time and effort making sure that word didn't apply to her. She stayed very still for a long moment. "Who is this?" she said, and her voice was slightly different. Not broken, just honest. "A woman I knew," Logan said carefully. "She passed. A while back. She's—" Ava stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry. This is unprofessional. You don't have to apologize. She looks like—" She stopped again. Then, without turning away from the painting, "My mother died 4 years ago. She was 58. Logan said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't intrude on whatever this moment was. "She used to garden," Ava said quietly. "She had this small plot in the back of the house where she grew up. She never really let it go. Even when she was busy, even when things were hard, she'd go out there and just—" She paused. She had that expression, that exact expression. Short pause. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this." "You don't have to know why," Logan said. "It's fine." Ava turned from the painting and looked at him, and there was something in her expression now that hadn't been there when she walked in, something direct and unguarded that made her look, briefly, less like a billionaire and more like a person. "That one," she said. "The one you won't offer. That's the one." "I understand." She looked down at the portfolio in her hands as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Mr. Pierce," she seemed to be choosing her words with more care than she had been. "You could have given me excuses tonight. Most people in your situation would have." She paused. "You didn't. Excuses don't change the balance." "No, they don't." She looked at him for a moment, then at the paintings, then back at him. "Tell me about the 2 you're offering as collateral." He brought those forward. She looked at them carefully, longer than a purely financial assessment would require, with the attention of someone who actually knew what she was looking at. He watched her eyes move across the brushwork, and he felt, strangely, not like a tenant trying to buy himself out of a corner, but like an artist being seen. It was an unfamiliar feeling. He didn't entirely know what to do with it. Finally, she straightened up and looked at him. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if you think the honest answer makes you look bad." "Okay. In 60 days, what actually changes? What's different?" It was a good question. It was the exact right question, the one he'd been asking himself since 2 in the morning, and he appreciated it in spite of himself. 2 of my 3 outstanding invoices get paid. I've confirmed that with both clients in the past week, one is paying next Friday, one is paying end of month. That's $1,100. I have 2 design projects I'm quoting this week. If I close one of them, that's another $1,200 minimum. I've reached out to 2 studios about contract work. One has indicated availability in 3 weeks. He paused. 60 days gets me to a different position. Not a guaranteed one, but a realistic one. What about the 3rd invoice? Client's not responsive. I've written it off. How much? $400. Ava nodded slowly. She was quiet again. Outside, a truck went by on the street, and the window glass vibrated slightly. The Callaway Arms building has 12 units, she said at last, almost to herself. It has a 43% tenant retention rate over the past 5 years, which is low. Meridian's been managing it with about as much personality as a parking garage. She glanced around the apartment. The paintings, the marigold-decorated calendar visible in the kitchen doorway, the horseprint throw blanket on the couch arm. This unit specifically has been lived in. I like it here, Logan said. It came out simpler than he intended. He just meant it. She looked at him once more, that filing away look, quick and comprehensive. Then she stood. I'm going to step outside and make a phone call, she said. Okay. I'll be 5 minutes, 10 at the most. He nodded. She went to the door and stepped into the hallway, and he stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by paintings, and listened to her footsteps go toward the stairs. He let out a slow breath. From down the hall, Marigold's voice. Dad? Stay in your room, Bug. Is she still here? She stepped out. A pause. Is it going okay? Logan looked at the portrait, the woman in the garden, the one he'd never offer as collateral to anyone for any amount of money, the one he'd somehow managed to put everything he was feeling into without understanding that was what he was doing until he'd stepped back and looked at the finished canvas. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I'll tell you when I know. The hallway was quiet. He could hear Ava Sterling's voice faint through the door, precise and measured. Someone used to making decisions at this hour, at any hour. Someone for whom Friday evening was not particularly different from Monday morning. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it and waiting and tried not to count the seconds. 7 minutes later, she knocked and came back in. Her expression was not the expression of someone who had called her legal team. It was something else, more considered, more personal. I have a counter-proposal, she said. She sat back down. He sat back down. The paintings remained where they were, witness to everything. I'm not taking your artwork as collateral, Ava said. I considered it. I understand the logic, but it creates a dynamic I'm not interested in, and it puts you in a position of... She paused. It's not the right arrangement. Logan held very still. He waited. I'll extend your balance to 60 days with no penalty, no formal default notation, no eviction proceedings. At the end of 60 days, you bring the account current. Full balance, current rent included. If you need to break it into 2 payments across that window, that's manageable. She held his gaze. One condition. What's the condition? Honest reporting. If things aren't moving in the direction you described in 3 weeks, you contact me directly, not Meridian, me, and we have a conversation about what's actually happening. I don't like surprises. Logan looked at her. That's the condition? That's the condition. No collateral, no artwork. No artwork. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the paintings. He thought about Marigold in her room, probably now reading the same page of her book for the 3rd time and wondering when she was going to be allowed to come out. I'll pay every dollar, he said. In 60 days or less. Ava nodded, once, like this matched an internal calculation she'd already run. I believe you, she said, and it was clear she did not say that lightly or often. She stood. She was at the door before he could put together anything that felt like an adequate response to the last hour and a half, and he followed her into the hallway. At the door, she paused and looked back at the room, at the painting of the woman in the garden, visible from where they stood. She looked at it for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she turned back. Mr. Pierce, she said. Logan. Logan, the name in her mouth like she was testing its weight. Keep working. She nodded toward the room, the canvases, All of them. Don't stop doing that. She left before he could answer. He stood at the open door listening to her heels on the stairwell, and then the lobby door opening and closing, and then he stood there a while longer in the yellow hallway light, not quite ready to go back inside and be normal yet. From down the hall, Marigold's door opened. She came padding out in her socks, hair mussed, book tucked under her arm, and stood in the hallway looking at him with those careful, clear eyes. "Well?" she said. Logan looked at his daughter. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly. Not yet. Not with the balance still on the clock and 60 days still to navigate. But something. "We're okay, Bug," he said. "For now, we're okay." Marigold came and leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the doorway looking at the apartment full of paintings together. "She didn't take any of them?" Marigold asked. "No." "Good," she said firmly. "They're ours." Logan looked at the woman in the garden, at the particular quality of light on her face, the light of a specific, unrepeatable afternoon, the light of something almost but not quite lost. "Yeah," he said, "they're ours." The first thing Logan did Saturday morning before Marigold was awake, before coffee, before anything else, was open his laptop and write Ava Sterling a message. He'd found her contact through the business card she'd left on his kitchen counter. He hadn't noticed her set it down, hadn't noticed her reach into that leather portfolio at all. But there it was when he came back from the door, a cream-colored card with clean sans serif type and a direct email address, no company logo, no title. Just her name and a way to reach her. He sat in the blue early morning quiet of the apartment and typed carefully. "Miss Sterling, thank you for last night. I'm aware that what you extended wasn't standard procedure, and I don't take it lightly. I'll have a status update for you in 3 weeks as agreed. LP." He read it over twice. It was short, maybe too short. He thought about adding more, something that expressed what the evening had actually meant, the way it had shifted something in him that he couldn't quite articulate yet, and then decided against it. Some things were better not explained. He sent it and closed the laptop. Marigold came out 40 minutes later in her pajamas with her hair like a bird's nest, announced she wanted waffles, and proceeded to stand next to him at the counter with total confidence while he made them, offering commentary on his technique that he found simultaneously irritating and delightful. She had opinions about waffle batter consistency. She had opinions about a lot of things. While they ate, she studied the living room, where the paintings still stood against the walls. He hadn't moved them back to the second bedroom yet. "Are they going to stay there?" she asked. "For a while, maybe." She tilted her head, looking at the one he called the diner piece. "That one's sad," she said. "You think?" "Not crying sad, thinking sad." She stabbed a piece of waffle, like when you're thinking about something important and nobody knows. Logan looked at the painting. He thought she was probably right. "Can I paint something today?" she asked. "After your room is clean." She groaned. This was a ritual. The complaint was mandatory, but she'd go clean her room within the hour because she actually liked painting, and she liked it more when she'd earned it somehow. He didn't know if he'd taught her that or if she'd arrived with it, but it was one of the things about her that made him feel like he was probably doing something right, even on the weeks when the evidence was hard to locate. He spent the morning at the kitchen table with his laptop and his phone, and the particular focused energy of someone who'd been granted borrowed time and intends to use every minute of it. He sent follow-up emails to both the clients with outstanding invoices. Polite, not desperate, just checking in. He drafted 2 new quotes for the prospects he'd mentioned to Ava, went over the numbers twice, and made sure he was pricing himself properly and not undercutting out of anxiety the way he'd done a few times before. He called the studio contact, a man named Dex who ran a mid-sized creative shop in Montclair, and left a message that was confident without being pushy. He was getting good at presenting himself as steadier than he felt. That was a skill he'd learned, not dishonesty, just the discipline of not letting the thing that was falling apart on the inside show up in your voice before it needed to. By noon, one invoice client had replied, "Payment would process Monday, $1,100. He stared at that email for a long moment, the particular relief of it washing through him and then receding, because $1,100 was not $2,460 and 60 days was now 59. He was doing the math again. He was going to be doing the math for a while. 3 weeks passed in the specific grinding way that weeks pass when you're waiting for things to resolve. He closed one of the 2 design quotes, a small brand identity project for a woman who ran an independent bookshop in Maplewood and had a very clear sense of what she wanted, which made his job both easier and harder. He liked clients who knew what they wanted. He also liked clients who gave him room to move. This one was the first kind, and he did the work carefully and well and invoiced her at project completion, and she paid within 48 hours, which almost never happened, and which he received with a gratitude disproportionate to the amount. The second quote went cold. The startup founder stopped responding to emails after a promising initial call. This happened more than it should in Logan's experience of the world, and he'd learned not to chase it past a certain point. He made a note and moved on. Dex called back at the end of week 2 with a contract offer. 12 weeks of brand work starting in 3 weeks, $1,500 a month. Not massive, but consistent. And consistent was what he needed right now. He said yes before Dex finished the sentence, then made himself slow down and ask 2 clarifying questions about scope and revision rounds so he didn't sound like someone who'd been waiting by the phone. He wasn't sleeping great, but he was sleeping better than he had during the eviction notice week. Marigold noticed. She was 7, not 4. She noticed everything and filed it away and brought it back out at unexpected moments. "You seem less circles," she told him one Wednesday morning, squinting at him over her cereal. "That's because I've been sleeping." "Because the apartment lady helped?" He paused. He told her simply that the situation had been worked out, that they were staying, that she didn't need to worry. He hadn't used the word helped. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." Marigold stirred her cereal. "She nice?" "I think so. It's hard to tell with some people until you know them better." "Do you know her better?" "Not yet." She appeared to consider the implications of this. "You should bring her a painting," she said, in the authoritative tone of someone who has resolved the problem and is ready to move on. That's what you do when someone does something good. You give them something good back. It doesn't really work like that between adults. Why? He didn't have a satisfying answer for this. "It just gets more complicated," he said. Marigold looked skeptical. She was skeptical of adult complications generally, and he didn't entirely blame her. He thought about the business card on the kitchen windowsill, where he'd moved it so it didn't get lost. He thought about the way Ava had looked at the portrait, the specific quality of recognition in her face, the way she'd gone still. He thought about what she'd said before she left. Keep working. He'd been painting more in the past 3 weeks than he had in the 6 months before the Hargrove client dropped him. He didn't entirely understand why. Maybe the financial pressure had stripped away some of the ambient dread that normally made it hard to start. Maybe it was something else. He'd sit down at the easel at 10 o'clock at night after Marigold was asleep and lose 2 hours without feeling them pass, which was the closest thing to peace he knew how to access. At exactly the 3-week mark, he drafted his update to Ava. He sat with it for almost an hour before he sent it. Not because he was struggling to write it, the facts were clear, but because he was trying to find the right tone. Professional, direct, not overly familiar, but not stiff either. The tone of someone who understood what kind of transaction this was and what kind of trust had been extended and was treating it with appropriate seriousness. He finally settled on Sterling. 3-week update as agreed. Invoice 1 has been paid, $1,100. Brand project completed and invoiced, paid in full, $1,200. New contract work begins in 10 days, 12 weeks, $1,500 per month. Current projected balance at 60-day mark, fully cleared, with approximately $400 remaining after account settlement. The situation is tracking the way I described. LP. He read it back, then added a single line at the bottom. I've also been painting. He wasn't sure why he added that. It felt like something she'd want to know. He sent it before he could overthink it and went to make coffee. Her response came 4 hours later, which he told himself meant nothing about whether she'd been checking her email. LP. Good. The contract was a smart move. Keep that margin where you can. And yes, I figured you were. AS. He read it twice. And yes, I figured you was doing something he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't particularly warm. It was just the tone of someone who had assessed him correctly and was noting, without fanfare, that the assessment held. He found this more affecting than he expected. He put his phone down. He went and looked at the painting he'd been working on for the past week. A new one, larger than most of his work. A street scene at dusk that he'd started from memory and had been pulling in unexpected directions. He stood in front of it for a long time without touching it, just looking, trying to understand what it was trying to be. Then he picked up the brush. Guac. Dex turned out to be a decent person to work for, which was not a given. Logan had worked for a number of creative directors over the years and had learned to manage his expectations from the first call. Dex was disorganized and tended to brief late and had a habit of texting feedback at 11 at night as though this were a normal thing to do, but he had a genuine visual sensibility, and when something landed, he said so without making a whole thing out of it, which Logan appreciated more than he would have admitted. The work itself was for a series of clients, a wellness brand, a local architecture firm, a restaurant group trying to reposition themselves, and it was solid, engaging work, the kind that used the real part of his brain rather than just the technical part. He found himself looking forward to going to the laptop in the mornings, which hadn't been true for a while. Marigold's school had its fall arts showcase in week 4, and she submitted 3 drawings: a horse, the apartment building rendered in crayon with slightly too large windows, and a portrait of Logan that captured his general silhouette and expression with an accuracy that was mildly alarming for a 7-year-old. Her teacher, Ms. Haverford, of the Puffy Circles, flagged the portrait specifically in her written comments. Marigold demonstrates strong observational instincts. Encourage this. Logan tacked the comment to the refrigerator next to the horse calendar. He wasn't sure if he was prouder of the drawing or the observation. In week 5, the second invoice client paid. It was late, nearly 3 weeks past the agreed date, and he'd sent 2 follow-up emails that had been deflecting and vague, and he'd started to build the assumption of that $400 not arriving into his calculations. When the transfer finally cleared, he stared at his banking app for a full minute and felt a complicated mix of relief and residual irritation that he allowed himself to feel for about 30 seconds before letting it go. He was at 80% of his target now, 52 days in, 8 days left. The call he hadn't anticipated came on a Thursday, at 2 in the afternoon, while he was in the middle of finishing a deliverable for Dex. It was a number he didn't recognize, a Manhattan area code, and he almost let it go to voicemail before something made him answer. "Is this Logan Pierce?" A woman's voice, business formal. "It is. This is Renata Voss. I work with Ava Sterling." A brief pause. "Ms. Sterling wanted me to reach out. She's been in conversation with someone who may be interested in your work and wondered if you'd be open to a studio visit." Logan set down his coffee very carefully. "A studio visit?" he repeated. "Yes. His name is Marcus Webb. He's a collector, primarily contemporary realism, which she mentioned aligns with your work. She showed him a few photographs." "She has photographs of my paintings?" There was a fractional pause on the line. "She took them during her visit to your apartment. She should have mentioned that." Something in Renata Voss's voice suggested she was mildly exasperated with her employer, but was too professional to say so. "Would you be open to the conversation? Mr. Webb is particular, but Ms. Sterling doesn't recommend artists unless she believes it's worth both parties' time." Logan stood up from the kitchen table and walked 3 steps toward the window, which was a thing he did when he needed to think and had nowhere else to go. Outside, a kid was riding a bike in slow, uncertain circles on the sidewalk. A woman walked by carrying 2 grocery bags and arguing quietly with someone on the phone. "Yes," he said, "I'm open to it. I'll have his assistant reach out to set a time. Early next week, if that works." "That works?" He stayed at the window after the call ended, watching the kid on the bike finally figure out the balance and start moving in a straight line, tentative and then less tentative, and then gone around the corner. He hadn't asked Ava to do this. He hadn't even imagined it as a possibility. He was still in the mental frame of the eviction notice, the math, the 60-day clock, the structure of someone managing a crisis, not someone with opportunities presenting themselves. And here was something arriving from outside that frame entirely, something he hadn't earned through a pitch or a proposal, something that had come because another person had seen his work and decided, on her own, without being asked, that it deserved to be seen by someone else. He didn't know what to do with that. He stood there a while longer, not knowing, and then he went back to the table and finished the deck's deliverable because the work was due at 4, and gratitude didn't extend deadlines. He emailed Ava that evening. He tried 3 drafts. The first was too formal, the second was too much, the third was close, but still not quite right. He settled on, "Renata called. I wanted to say, you didn't have to do that. I'm not sure I have a more elegant way to put it. It means more than I know how to say cleanly in an email. Thank you." He sat with it for a moment, then added, "And for the record, if you wanted photographs, you could have just asked." He was almost surprised at himself for including that last line. It was too close to teasing, probably. The wrong register for the relationship, which was tenant and landlord, formal arrangement, professional distance. He sent it anyway. Her reply came faster this time. Less than 2 hours. "I know I didn't have to. That's generally when it's worth doing something. And you're right. I should have asked. I'll remember that." Then, after a pause, he knew it was a pause because the timestamp on the second message was 3 minutes after the first. "How are you doing on the math?" He smiled before he could stop himself, which he found annoying. He typed back, 8 days out, 92% there. "I'll make it. I know you will," she wrote. "I calculated the same thing from your update." He set the phone down and looked at the apartment. The paintings were still out. He'd never put them back, and eventually Marigold had started arranging them with opinions about which ones went where, and the whole second bedroom had transformed into a working space that he actually used now instead of a storage room he avoided. He'd stretched 3 new canvases that week. He thought about Marcus Webb. He thought about the way Dorcas Reeve had looked at the 3 pieces during the appraisal, that long, serious silence before she wrote anything down. He thought about the way Ava had stood in front of the woman in the garden portrait, and the way her face had opened in spite of herself. He'd spent 8 years treating his painting like a side door in his life, something real and important, but somehow not the main entrance, not the thing you led with. The design work was the main entrance. The design work paid rent. The painting was what he did when the practical world wasn't watching, and maybe that arrangement had never been as settled as he'd let himself believe. He went to the second bedroom. The studio now, he was starting to think of it that way, and stood in the doorway looking at the new large canvas, the street scene at dusk that had been pulling in unexpected directions. He'd been working on it in pieces over the past few weeks, and it was close to done, and it was better than most of his work, and he knew it, and that knowledge sat in him with the specific weight of something that mattered. He went in and picked up the brush. On day 58, he transferred the full balance, $2,460 plus the current month's rent. He did it through the standard Meridian Group payment portal, which felt anticlimactic given everything, but he wasn't sure there was a ceremonially appropriate way to pay back the most significant financial obligation of the year. He watched the transaction clear and then sat back and felt the absence of the number. The weight of it, which had been present somewhere in his body for 2 months, now simply gone. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired and relieved, and something else underneath those 2 things that was harder to name. Like the end of a particular chapter, and the next one not quite started yet. He emailed Ava with the confirmation number and 2 lines. Balance cleared as of this morning, 2 days ahead of schedule. Thank you for the 60 days. I won't forget that you gave them to me. Her response, 2 hours later, confirmed, received. And Logan, you didn't need 60 days. You needed someone to stop counting them for 5 minutes. There's a difference. He read that message 3 times. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. It felt like something important that he didn't have a category for yet, something that was asking him to reconsider the shape of the past 2 months and what they'd actually been. He was still thinking about it at dinner and at bedtime, and later when he was washing dishes and Marigold had been asleep for an hour. He was still thinking about it, though he was trying not to, when he went to the studio and stood in front of the street scene canvas and looked at it under the lamp's warm light. It was done. He'd known it was done for 3 days and had been making small adjustments anyway, the way you do when a thing is finished but you're not ready to let go of the doing of it. He stepped back, The painting was large, 4 feet by 2.5, and it showed a city street in the late hour before dark, that specific time when the light goes amber and long and ordinary things cast extraordinary shadows. There were 3 figures in it, none of them distinct, none of them portraits. Just people, present on a street, each carrying something, bags, jackets, the weight of their days. There was a quality of the light that he'd been working toward for weeks, something about the way it fell at an angle through a gap between 2 buildings and lit a portion of the sidewalk while leaving everything else in cooler shade. He'd been painting Ava Sterling for 2 weeks without understanding that was what he was doing, not her face. He had no photograph of her, and he wasn't the kind of painter who worked from memory that way. But the painting had her quality somehow, that careful, contained intelligence, the sense of someone moving through the world with all of themselves held close, not from coldness, but from something that had learned to protect itself and hadn't fully learned when to stop. He stood there a long time. Then he went to bed, and the painting stayed where it was, and in the morning the question of what to do about it had not resolved itself. But the morning light through the studio window hit the canvas at a new angle and showed him something in the left third that wasn't quite right yet, and he picked up the brush again before he made coffee, which Marigold pointed out when she came looking for him at 7:15. "You started painting before coffee," she said from the doorway, alarmed. "I know. That's new. I know." She considered him and the canvas and the morning light all together in that slow, thorough way of hers. "It's really good, Dad," she said finally. He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, which was as close as he usually got to agreeing with himself. Marcus Webb arrived on a Tuesday. Logan had cleaned the studio twice, once the night before and once that morning, which was excessive and he knew it. But the anxiety had to go somewhere and it wasn't going into the painting, so it went into reorganizing the same shelf of art supplies twice and wiping down a window ledge that was already clean. Marigold was at school. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it was only quiet on weekday mornings, a different quality of silence than weekends, more purposeful. Webb was 60-something, shorter than Logan expected, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades deciding what was worth his time and had gotten very comfortable with that process. He wore a wool jacket and no tie and carried nothing with him, no portfolio, no notebook, not even a phone visible. He shook Logan's hand at the door with a brief, firm grip and stepped inside and immediately looked at the walls. He didn't say anything for a while. Logan had arranged the studio, the second bedroom, with the 12 best pieces out and the others stacked in the corner. He'd put the large street scene canvas on the main easel because it was the most recent, and because he believed it was the best thing he'd made. And he'd spent 40 minutes the night before arguing with himself about whether leading with your best piece was confident or desperate, and had eventually landed on, it doesn't matter, just do it. Webb moved through the room slowly. He looked at each piece with the same careful attention, not speaking, not reacting visibly. Logan stood near the doorway and did not offer commentary. He'd learned early that explaining your work to someone in the middle of looking at it was one of the least useful things you could do, both for them and for yourself. After about 15 minutes, Webb stopped in front of the street scene. Another long silence. "How long did this take you?" he asked finally. "About 3 weeks, on and off." "What do you mean, on and off?" "I was working other jobs. I'd come in at night, sometimes early morning, maybe 20-25 hours total." Webb tilted his head slightly to the right. "The light in the left third. What about it? How did you get that?" It wasn't quite a question. Logan thought about it. "I stood on a specific corner in my neighborhood for about 40 minutes one evening until I understood what the light was doing. Then I came home and tried to remember it accurately instead of trying to reproduce it." Webb turned and looked at him. "There's a difference." "Yeah. Reproducing it makes it a photograph. Remembering it makes it yours." Webb looked back at the canvas. "Ava said you were worth seeing," he said, the way someone states a fact they are in the process of verifying. "She's not usually wrong about this kind of thing. She's been wrong about other things, but not this." Logan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. "I want the street piece," Webb said, "and the diner piece, the woman at the counter. Do you have a price on those?" Logan had numbers. He'd researched comparable sales, looked at what similar scale work by artists at his approximate career stage was moving for, run it by the Dorcas Reeve appraisals as a reference point. He said the numbers clearly without hedging, and Webb nodded once and said he'd have his assistant follow up, and that was apparently the entire negotiation. At the door, Webb paused and looked back into the apartment. "You should be showing," he said. "Not a group show somewhere with 8 other people. Your own show. Soon." He said it the way someone says a thing that they consider obvious and are mildly puzzled hasn't happened yet. Then he left. Logan stood at the closed door for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and drank a full glass of water standing at the counter, because his mouth had been dry for the last hour, and he hadn't wanted to interrupt the visit to deal with it. He thought about calling someone. His sister, maybe. His friend Dante, who'd been asking about the painting situation for months. Instead, he sent a single text to a number he was increasingly comfortable reaching for. Webb came. He wants 2 pieces. 3 minutes later, "I know. He texted me from your hallway. Told you he wasn't usually wrong." Logan stared at that, then typed, "He texted you from my hallway? He does that. Ignore it. How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. Like, I need to sit down for a minute, and also, like, I want to go paint something immediately, both at the same time. Her response took slightly longer this time. That's probably what it's supposed to feel like. The money from Webb came through 8 days later. Both pieces, the price Logan had named without negotiation, transferred clean and without the usual 30 to 60-day wait that the art world sometimes imposed as though prompt payment were somehow beneath its dignity. Logan deposited it, looked at his bank balance for a long moment, and thought about the $4.63 that had lived there 3 months ago. He took Marigold to her favorite Italian place for dinner that night. Not a special occasion place, just a neighborhood spot with red check tablecloths and bread that came in a basket before you ordered, and pasta that was reliably good without being precious about it. She ordered the same thing she always ordered, which was fettuccine with butter and parmesan, and ate it with the focused satisfaction of someone whose needs are specific and consistently met. "Did something good happen?" she asked, halfway through dinner. "Yeah." "The painting thing?" "The painting thing." She nodded, processing. "The apartment lady helped with that, right? The one who came." He'd been careful about how much of the adult situation he'd shared with Marigold. She knew they'd had a hard few months. She knew it had gotten better. She'd absorbed it with the flexible, forward-facing resilience that kids that age seemed to have access to in ways that adults mysteriously lost. Taking the information in, adjusting, continuing. "She helped," he said. "Yes." Marigold twirled her fork in the pasta with careful concentration. "So she's a good person." "I think she is." "But you said it was hard to tell." "I've told you more since then." She looked up at him. "Are you friends?" Logan thought about the emails. The way they'd gotten shorter and more direct as the weeks went on, the professional remove gradually replaced by something that had more friction in it. The comfortable friction of 2 people who have started speaking honestly with each other. He thought about, "And yes, I figured you were." He thought about, "You needed someone to stop counting for 5 minutes." He thought about the fact that she'd taken photographs of his paintings at some point during that first evening, quietly and without comment, and had been carrying them around on her phone for 2 months. "I'm not sure what we are," he said honestly. Marigold appeared to find this acceptable. She went back to her pasta. "You should invite her to dinner sometime," she said. "That's how you find out." Logan looked at his daughter. She had a piece of parmesan on her chin, and she was entirely serious. "It's not really that simple," he said. "It's just dinner, Dad." He didn't have a good answer for this either. The kid kept doing that, arriving at the clear, direct version of things that he'd been circling for weeks, stating it as though it were obvious, and then going back to her food. Ava Sterling's office was in a glass and steel tower in Midtown that Logan had walked past a dozen times without knowing it was connected to her in any way. He was there for a different reason. A meeting with a potential new client, an architecture firm on the 14th floor, and he was in the lobby waiting for the elevator when he heard his name. He turned. She was crossing the lobby toward a side exit, carrying the leather portfolio he remembered from the first night, talking to a man in a suit who was keeping up with her at a slight hustle. She'd seen him from across the lobby, apparently, had altered her course fractionally toward the elevators while still managing to appear like she hadn't. "Logan?" She stopped. The man in the suit stopped with her, slightly out of breath. "Hey." He was aware this was not his most articulate moment. She looked at him with that same quick, comprehensive assessment. In here, not at his apartment, in her territory, she looked entirely different. Not colder, just fully at home in a way that was its own kind of authority. She was wearing something sharply cut in deep navy, her hair down in a way he hadn't seen before, and she looked like a person who made decisions that affected buildings full of people before 9 in the morning and was fine with that. "This is unexpected," she said. "I have a meeting on 14, architecture firm." "Linden and Park." She said it immediately. "Good people. James Linden likes things cleaner than his partner. Watch for that. They'll pull in opposite directions if you let them." He blinked. "You know them." "They were clients of mine 2 years ago, commercial space design." She glanced at the suit-wearing man who had silently retreated 2 steps with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned when to disappear. "How are you doing on new work?" "Better. Web moved faster than I expected. I have 2 more people who want studio visits. Renata sent their names last week." Something shifted in her expression. Subtle. The particular satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed. "You should have a website," she said. "A real one. Not a portfolio page, an actual site. And you need better photographs of the work." "I've been meaning to, not meaning to, do it." She said it without apology, the way she'd probably said 100 things in this lobby to 100 different people, direct and certain and not unkind. The collector's web knows talk to each other. When they look you up, what they find should be worth finding. "Okay." He paused. "You know you don't have to—" "I'm aware." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm going to be in the building anyway. Get your meeting." She moved toward the exit. He watched her go, and she was almost there when she turned back slightly, just her head, the leather portfolio held at her side. "Let me know how Linden goes," she said. Then she was gone through the revolving door, and the lobby resumed around him, all marble and purposeful movement, as though the previous 2 minutes had been entirely routine. The meeting went well. James Linden was, in fact, cleaner in his visual preferences than his partner, who pushed toward something more expressive. Logan found the middle ground by the end of the first hour, which was earlier than these things usually resolved, and left with a commission and the sense that Ava had given him a useful advantage without being asked. He texted her on the way to the elevator. "Linden went well. You were right about the dynamic." Her reply came before he reached the lobby. "I'm usually right about dynamics. It's other things I'm less reliable on." He stood in the elevator reading that message and couldn't tell exactly how much it was revealing. He filed it under the growing category of things about Ava Sterling that he didn't have complete information on yet and wasn't sure how to ask about. The invitation came from Renata, another phone call, very Ava, never quite directly, always through the official channel of Renata's calm, slightly exasperated professionalism. "Ms. Sterling is hosting a small gathering at her home on Saturday evening," Renata said. "Several collectors, a gallery director, 1 or 2 artists. She'd like you to come. As a guest or as an artist she's recommending, socially. There's no agenda if that's what you're asking." A small pause. "She said to tell you it's not an audition." "Okay." "She also said to dress like you're proud of the work, not like you're apologizing for it." Logan was quiet for a moment. "She said that specifically." "Word for word," Renata confirmed with the neutral tone of someone who has delivered stranger messages and managed fine. He told Mrs. Petrakis downstairs, who had a standing arrangement with Logan to look after Marigold on evenings he needed. And Mrs. Petrakis said yes before he finished the question and immediately began asking what he was planning to wear, because she had opinions and considered herself a resource he underutilized. "Something good," he said. "That's not an answer," she said. He spent 45 minutes on Saturday afternoon standing in front of his closet with a level of analytical intensity more appropriate to a canvas than a clothing rack, and eventually settled on a dark charcoal shirt and well-fitted trousers, which Marigold inspected with the seriousness of a fashion consultant who happened to be in second grade. "You look nice," she said, which from Marigold meant she'd passed muster. "Don't stay up past 9, he told her. "I won't," she said, in the tone of someone who absolutely intended to. Ava's home was not what Logan had pictured, though he'd told himself firmly that he hadn't been picturing it. It was a brownstone in the West Village, narrow-faced from the street, but deeper than it looked, 4 floors, with the kind of quiet presence that old New York buildings had when they'd been well cared for over generations. Not a glass tower, not a showroom, a house. A home, actually, which surprised him in a way he couldn't immediately account for. Renata met him at the door, an actual person at an actual door, which he'd half expected to be replaced by some automated entry system, and led him through a front hall lined with art. Not ostentatiously lined. Just paintings and photographs hung at intervals on pale walls, lit properly, the way things are hung when the person who chose them was thinking about the work and not about the effect. He stopped at one piece without meaning to. It was a small oil painting, older work, 19th century by the look of it, of a woman in a kitchen, back to the viewer, a window above the sink letting in morning light. It was modest in size and absolutely precise in its understanding of light. "She bought that at an estate sale when she was 24, said Ava's voice behind him. He turned. She was coming from somewhere in the back of the house, a glass in her hand, wearing something simple and dark that made her look entirely herself. Not the Midtown version, not the formal portfolio version, just a person in her own home on a Saturday night. It was the first real piece she bought, Ava continued, coming to stand beside him and looking at the painting. She paid more than she should have. She was just starting out, didn't have the money to be spending on a painting. She paused. She always said it was the best decision she ever made, not because of what it was worth, because of what it taught her about what she cared about. "She?" Logan asked carefully. Ava was quiet a moment. "My mother." She looked at the painting for another beat, then away. "Come in. There are people I want you to meet." The gathering was small, 12 people in the main room, which had high ceilings and bookshelves along one wall and her own collection arranged throughout, each piece given room to exist. He'd expected something more performative, the art world version of a business event, networking barely concealed beneath aesthetic appreciation. It wasn't that. The people were knowledgeable and comfortable, talking about work and travel and difficult things alongside the easy things, the conversation moving the way it did when the host had selected the room with more care than the occasion required. She moved through the room with the same settled intention he'd observed in the lobby, but there was something softer in her at home. Not unguarded, but less armored. She checked on people. She refilled drinks without making it a gesture. She knew when to introduce and when to leave two people alone with a conversation they were finding on their own. She introduced Logan to a woman named Helen Park, who ran a gallery in Chelsea. Not Dorcas Reeves' gallery, a different one, more established, and stood back while they talked, contributing occasionally, mostly letting it run. Helen Park was direct and a little severe and clearly knew exactly what she was looking at when she looked at art, and by the end of 20 minutes, she'd asked Logan if he'd be willing to discuss a show in the spring. He said yes. He said it clearly, without the hedging, or the what would that look like, or the let me check my schedule that might have come out of his mouth 6 months ago. Helen Park nodded and said she'd be in touch and moved on, and Logan found himself standing briefly alone near the bookshelves. He looked at the spines, the real mixture of a person who actually reads, not a curated display, some old and broken-spined, some new, the occasional postcard or receipt tucked inside as a bookmark. "You passed," Ava said quietly beside him. She had appeared without announcement, the way she seemed to do. "Was there a test?" "Helen Park is a test. She tests everyone. Most people talk too much when she does that. Try to fill the silence with credentials. You didn't. I just answered what she asked. That's the test." She glanced at him sideways. "How are you doing?" "I'm good. This is..." He looked around the room. "This is your world, isn't it? Part of it?" "Which part?" She seemed to consider this genuinely. "The part I actually like," she said. "The work part, the buildings, the finance, the investment strategy. That's what I'm good at. This is what I like. There's a difference. I know there is, Logan said. She looked at him. He held her gaze and something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to, just the particular shift that happens when two people who have been communicating at a careful, professional remove suddenly find themselves standing in the same space at the same hour and realize the remove has been doing less work than they thought. I have Claude's response was interrupted. Try again. She never finished the sentence. Someone across the room said her name, a man in a gray blazer who needed her opinion on something, and she turned toward the sound with the reflexive professionalism of someone accustomed to being needed. And the moment closed the way moments do when they aren't quite ready to be what they are yet. Logan watched her cross the room and picked up his drink and stood by the bookshelves a while longer, looking at the spines without reading them. He drove home that night in a particular kind of quiet. Not the heavy quiet of bad news or unresolved problems, but the thoughtful quiet of someone who has been given new information and doesn't know yet what to do with it. The city moved outside the car windows in its usual way. Headlights and storefronts and the lit windows of buildings where other people were living other lives. And he let it pass without trying to think too hard. Mrs. Petrakis reported that Marigold had stayed up until 9:45, which he'd expected, and had eaten 2 cookies she wasn't supposed to have, which he'd also expected. He thanked her and carried Marigold, already deeply asleep, from the couch to her bed, and stood in her doorway a moment before pulling the door mostly shut. He went to the studio and stood in front of the empty easel. He didn't paint. He just stood there a while, thinking about something that wasn't quite articulable yet, and then he went to bed. Helen Park's assistant emailed on Monday. The proposed show was for March, 4 months out, and the gallery was interested in 12 to 15 pieces, primarily new work, with the option to include 2 or 3 of the earlier pieces Logan had already sold as loans for display if the buyers agreed. The email was professional and specific, and made clear that Helen Park was extending this offer because she believed in the commercial and critical viability of the work, not as a favor, which Logan found both slightly chilling and deeply clarifying. This was not someone doing him a kindness. This was someone making a business decision. He wrote back the same day accepting the terms and asked for a contract to review. Then he sat for a long time with the particular weight of having said yes to the largest professional thing he'd ever said yes to, and tried to figure out if what he was feeling was excitement or terror, and concluded it was probably both, and that was probably correct. He told Dex he needed to reduce his contract hours starting in January, which was a conversation he'd been dreading and which turned out to be significantly less difficult than he'd built it up to be. Dex said he'd figured something like this was coming, said he'd work with 10 hours a week instead of the full rate, and added that if Logan's show went well, he wanted first crack at commissioning something for the studio's lobby wall, which was either generosity or early investment, probably both. He told his sister on a Sunday phone call. She said Logan, in the careful voice, and then, when he kept talking, the voice changed, and by the end of the call, she was crying slightly, and he was pretending not to notice, which was their established protocol for emotional situations. He did not immediately tell Ava. He wasn't sure why. They'd been texting more frequently since the Saturday gathering. Not daily, nothing with that kind of pattern, but a looser back and forth that had stopped being about the rent situation and started being about other things. She'd sent him a photograph of a small painting she'd spotted in an auction catalog and asked his opinion on whether the provenance was as clean as listed. He'd told her it looked right to him, but to consult someone with more expertise in that period. She'd replied, "You're becoming less useful as a yes man." He'd replied, "I was never a yes man." She'd replied, "No." That's been the problem from the beginning. He read that last message multiple times over 3 days without answering it, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew too well and wasn't sure the time was right. He told her about the show 2 weeks after he'd confirmed it. He did it in person. She'd asked if he wanted to walk through the Callaway Arms building with her while she assessed some maintenance issues, which was probably the least romantic pretext for spending time together that he could imagine. But he'd said yes, and they'd spent an hour walking through the building looking at aging radiators and a hallway that needed repainting and the lobby fixture that had been broken for 6 weeks. And at the end of it, standing on the front steps in the November cold, he told her. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment with that specific processing stillness, and then she looked at him. "March," she said. "March." Helen Park doesn't do March shows for artists she isn't serious about. She said it flatly, as fact, not compliment. "I know. How many new pieces do you have?" "6 that I'm confident in. I need 8 or 9 more." "4 months?" "I know." She looked at the street. A couple walked past with a dog that was deeply invested in a patch of sidewalk, and they waited for it with the patient resignation of people who had accepted that dogs set the pace. "You'll need to stop doing anything that isn't the work," she said. "I'm already cutting back on contract hours." "Cut back more." She turned to face him. "What are you keeping?" "Dex, 10 hours a week." "Cut it to 5. "I need to eat, Ava." "I know you need to eat. I'm not saying starve. I'm saying 5 hours of contract work and the rest goes to the show." She held his gaze. "You have 4 months to make 9 paintings that are as good as the ones Helen Park saw. That's a painting every 2 weeks, roughly. That's not a lot of time if you're splitting your focus. Most of the painters I know would say that's aggressive. Most of the painters you know aren't showing at Helen Park's gallery in March." He was quiet. The cold was settling in, the November kind that moved through your jacket if you stood still long enough. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. He didn't say it to be difficult. He said it because it was the honest question, the one sitting underneath everything else, and he'd been carrying it for weeks. She was quiet for longer than she usually was before answering. Something moved across her face. Not discomfort exactly, but the expression of someone encountering a question they'd been avoiding and finding it has arrived anyway. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is this close to something real and doesn't know it," she said. "And because I've seen people that close back away from it and spend years explaining to themselves why that was the practical decision." A pause. "I don't want to watch that happen." The street was quiet between them. "That's not a complete answer," Logan said. "I know it isn't." She looked at him directly. "I'm working on the rest of it." He held her gaze. She held his. The couple with the dog had long since moved on. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay what?" "Okay, I'll cut to 5 hours. And okay, I'll wait for the rest of the answer." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the specific easing that precedes one, the moment before. "You're very annoying," she said. "I've been told." She pulled her coat tighter and turned toward the street. "I'm going to be late." She was already moving, that settled intention walk that he could identify now from some distance. She got 3 steps before she stopped and looked back. "Logan?" "Yeah." "The show is going to be good." She said it the way she said things she knew to be true. Not for his benefit, just as information. Then she was gone, heels on the sidewalk, and he stood on the front steps of the Callaway Arms in the cold for another minute before going inside. He cut to 5 hours a week with Dex, who took it without complaint and with the slightly smug expression of someone who'd called this outcome already. He told Renata, who had become, in a low-key way, a useful professional contact in her own right, that he'd need photography done on the existing 6 pieces. And Renata recommended someone good and efficient who came on a Thursday and spent 3 hours shooting the work with a precision that made Logan understand he'd been photographing his own work badly for years. December arrived, and the studio became the center of the apartment's gravity. Marigold had fully accepted this transition and had taken to doing her homework at the small table Logan had moved into the corner of the room, doing her worksheets while he painted, the two of them coexisting in the focused, comfortable silence of people who'd figured out how to share space without requiring anything from each other. She occasionally offered observations. "That one's cold," she said one evening, looking up from her spelling list at the canvas he was working on. A figure in a winter park, sitting on a bench, face turned away. "Cold how?" "Lonely cold. Not just weather cold." He looked at the painting. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." She went back to her spelling. He kept working. He was making good paintings. He knew this the same way he'd always known. That clear internal signal that wasn't arrogance and wasn't false modesty, just recognition. The pressure of the show's deadline had stripped away some of the second-guessing that normally slowed him. He'd start a piece, it would go wrong, he'd work through the wrong part instead of abandoning it, and sometimes what came out on the other side of the wrong part was the best thing in the painting. He'd lost 3 canvases completely that way. Painted over them, started again. But he'd learned something from each failure that showed up in what came after. By mid-December, he had 9 new pieces and was starting the 10th. Ava came to see them on a Saturday 2 weeks before Christmas. He hadn't invited her exactly. She'd asked, in one of their texts, if she could see where the show work was heading, and he'd said yes, and they'd agreed on a Saturday, and he told Marigold a friend was coming over, which was technically accurate and left enough unsaid to avoid a 7-year-old's interrogation. Marigold opened the door before Logan reached it, because she had superhuman hearing when it came to knocking, and stood in the doorway looking at Ava with the frank, assessing gaze she applied to all new information. Ava looked down at her. "You must be Marigold. You're the apartment lady," Marigold said. "That's one title." Ava said it without condescension, matching the kid's directness with her own. "Dad said you were nice, but hard to tell. He said it more clearly now, though." Logan arrived at the door. "Marigold." "What?" "You did." Ava glanced at Logan with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. "I'll take that as progress," she said. Inside, Marigold immediately appointed herself guide and led Ava toward the studio before Logan could intervene, talking the entire way with the authority of someone who had watched these paintings arrive in the world and considered herself an expert. "This one's the Lonely Cold one," Marigold said in the studio, pointing at the Winter Park piece. "I named it. Dad didn't give it a name yet, so I named it." "I haven't named any of them yet," Logan said. "I named them all," Marigold said. "I have a list." Ava looked at the Winter Park piece. She was doing the thing she'd done at the apartment the first night. Really looking, not performing looking. Her eyes moved through the canvas methodically, and her face did very little. "What else did you name it?" she asked Marigold. Marigold produced from the pocket of her jeans a folded piece of notebook paper with a hand-drawn chart on it. "Lonely Cold, the 2 kids in summer, the fast lady. That one's a street scene. Old hands because of the hands." She ran a finger down her list. "Waiting, almost, the one Dad's still working on. I just called unfinished until he finishes it. And the new big one I call the whole thing, because it feels like everything at once." Ava looked at the last piece Marigold had referenced. The largest canvas in the room, 4 feet by 4, the most ambitious piece Logan had attempted. It showed nothing specific, or rather it showed everything at a specific angle. A building, its light, the suggestion of people inside without any person being fully rendered, the whole scene pressing towards something that wasn't quite arrived yet. She looked at it for a long time. "The whole thing," she said quietly. "That's what it feels like," Marigold confirmed. Ava turned to Logan. Something in her expression was different from the gallery evening version, different from the Midtown lobby version, different even from the front steps of Callaway Arms version. She looked, in the specific light of the studio on a December Saturday with a 7-year-old standing between them holding a naming chart, like herself. Just herself. No performance, no distance, no careful management of what was visible. "This is the best one," she said, nodding at the large piece. "I know. It should be the last thing in the show, the thing people walk toward." "That's what Helen Park said, too." "Then we're both right." She looked around the room, at the 9 completed canvases, at the half-finished 10th on the easel, at the organized chaos of paints and brushes and stretched empty frames waiting. "You made all of this in 4 months. Not all of it. The work from before, I mean since the show was confirmed, 4 months." She said it not with wonder exactly, but with the recognition of someone who understands what 4 months of serious, scared, determined work actually looks like. "It's not done yet," he said. "No, but you know where it's going." She held his gaze. "You knew where it was going from the beginning. You just needed a reason to go there." Marigold had settled herself on the floor with her naming list, apparently satisfied that the adult conversation was proceeding without her direct management, and was now adding notes to her chart with a pencil she'd produced from somewhere. Logan looked at Ava. The distance that had been there since the beginning, the professional boundary, the careful register, the deliberate not saying of things, had compressed to something much smaller. Not gone. but small enough that the effort of maintaining it was becoming more noticeable than the effort of not maintaining it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Okay." "The painting I wouldn't offer is collateral. The woman in the garden. She was still. I made it during the worst year of my life," he said. "After my marriage ended, when Marigold was still small and I didn't know how to hold it all together, I painted it because I needed to put something real on a canvas, or I was going to come apart." He paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you this now." "I think you do," Ava said quietly. He looked at her. She was right, he did. "It's not for sale," he said. "It's never going to be for sale. But I want you to have it." The studio was very quiet. Marigold had stopped writing on her list. "Logan, not as a transaction, not as a thank you for the 60 days, just," he stopped, finding the word, "because you looked at it the way it deserved to be looked at. That first night. And because your mother would have," he stopped again. He wasn't sure he had the right to finish that sentence. "I think she would have liked it," he said simply. Ava pressed her lips together. She was doing the same thing she'd done in the apartment the first night, absorbing something that had arrived without warning, working to keep her face composed while something underneath it was doing something else entirely. "That's a considerable thing to offer," she said. Her voice was careful. "I know. I haven't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't have a lot of experience with people who give things without a structure around them. A contract, an expectation, some kind of arrangement." She looked at him. "Most things in my world have a structure." "Most things in mine too," Logan said. "That one doesn't. It's just what it is." A long pause. From the floor, Marigold said, without looking up from her chart, "You should say yes." Both of them looked down at her. She was writing something on the list with perfect composure. "She gives good advice," Logan said. "She's terrifying," Ava said, but her voice had changed. Something had come loose in it, some last careful tension. She looked back at Logan, and the space between them held a quality that he recognized from paintings. The moment before a thing becomes what it is, when all the elements are present but not yet resolved. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to have it." He nodded. She nodded. Marigold wrote something on her list, folded it, and put it back in her pocket with the satisfaction of someone whose work here was done. January was the hardest month to paint and the most productive month he'd had in years. He finished the 10th piece, started and finished 2 more, and produced a 13th that he almost scrapped twice and then didn't, and which Helen Park, when she saw the photographs, called the most surprising thing in the entire show, with a tone that indicated surprise was precisely what she was after. He and Ava had dinner, actual dinner, not accidentally occupying the same room, twice in January. The first time was at a small Italian place in the West Village that she suggested and he'd never been to, and they talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with rent or paintings or the architecture of professional distance, and he drove home afterward in the same thoughtful quiet as after the gathering, but a different version of it. The second dinner was at his apartment. He cooked, badly, by his own assessment, the risotto too thick, and Marigold sat with them for the first part of the meal and conducted what was essentially an interview, asking Ava about her favorite color, she didn't have one, which Marigold found suspicious, what she thought of horses, fine, she said, they're impressive, which Marigold accepted, and whether she'd ever been to the top of a really tall building, many times, in the course of owning them, which made Marigold's eyes go wide. When Logan put Marigold to bed, the kid grabbed his arm at the door and said, in a carrying whisper that absolutely reached the kitchen, "I like her." "I know, Bug. She's different from regular people. Go to sleep." "I'm just saying." Back in the kitchen, Ava was standing at the counter with her wine glass looking at the horse calendar on the refrigerator, at the drawing of Logan that Marigold had done for the school art show, still tacked beside Ms. Haverford's comment, at the eviction notice, which he'd never thrown away and which was tucked behind the calendar, partially visible. She looked at it for a moment. "You kept it," she said when he came back in. "Seemed important." He stood beside her at the counter. "Context. For when things are going well and you need to remember what going badly actually felt like." She looked at the drawing of Logan, Marigold's version of him, the oversized silhouette, the particular expression she'd captured. "She sees you clearly," Ava said. She sees everything clearly. It's her best quality, and occasionally her most exhausting one. Ava turned her head and looked at him. They were standing close in the kitchen, the particular closeness of a small space and a late evening and a conversation that had been building for weeks. And the distance that remained between them had narrowed to something that was no longer about professional arrangement or careful management. It was just the ordinary, terrifying distance between two people who haven't yet said the thing that is obviously true. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly and without self-pity. "Just fact. The regular version of this. The not having a structure version. I know. I'm going to be bad at it in specific ways that I can probably predict. I'm going to be bad at it in ways I probably can't predict," Logan said. "So that makes us even." She looked at him for a moment, and the last of the careful distance left her face, and she laughed. A real one. Unguarded, the kind that doesn't perform anything. It changed her completely. He'd seen her controlled and professional, and moved and thoughtful, but he hadn't seen this version, the laughing version, and it arrived in him with the impact of something that settles into the deepest part of what you care about and stays. "This is probably a terrible idea," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "You're my tenant. For now, the deck's money plus what I've made on the paintings," he paused. "I've been looking at some other places in the building. Mrs. Petrakis mentioned the third-floor unit opening up." Ava raised an eyebrow. "You want to move within my building to make this less complicated?" "I want to move to a bigger apartment because Marigold needs her own studio space and I need mine. The less complicated thing is a secondary benefit." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this?" "For a while." She set her wine glass down on the counter. He could see her running the thing, so not the logistics, not the practical arrangement, but the actual thing, the weight of it, what it would mean to let someone into the life she'd built with its clean lines and high walls and the small estate sale painting in the front hall that she'd bought at 24 because she understood what she cared about. "I want to see Marigold's face when she finds out she's getting a studio," Ava said finally. "She'll probably make a list of what goes where before the boxes are unpacked." "Of course she will." Something softened in Ava's face. Not just the laugh this time, something deeper and more deliberate. A choice. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Ask about the third-floor unit. Talk to Renata." A pause. "And stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're about to paint me." He was quiet for a beat. "I might be," he said honestly. She picked up her wine glass. She was smiling now, still, the real version. "Well," she said, "ask first this time." The show opened on a Thursday in March, which Logan would later think was a fitting day for it. Not a Friday, when everything feels like a celebration waiting to happen. Not a Monday, when the world is braced for difficulty. A Thursday, ordinary and specific, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself but becomes the one you remember. He'd been at the gallery since 10 in the morning, watching Helen Park's installation team hang the pieces with a precision that was almost surgical. Helen herself moved through the space with a clipboard and a critical eye, adjusting angles by degrees that Logan couldn't distinguish, but that she apparently could. And she spoke to him only twice before noon. Once to confirm the sequencing of 3 pieces near the east wall, and once to tell him, with the clipped matter-of-factness he'd come to understand was her version of warmth, that the show was going to hold up. "You mean sell well?" he asked. "I mean, hold up," she said, as though he'd missed something obvious. "Selling is easy if the work holds. The work holds when it doesn't need the viewer to explain it to themselves." She looked at the 13th piece, the one she'd called the most surprising, the one he'd almost scrapped twice, where it hung near the back corner. That one especially. He didn't ask her to elaborate. He'd learned to take Helen Park's assessments without requiring translation. Marigold had wanted to come for the setup, and he'd told her no, that today was work, and she'd accepted this with the kind of pointed patience that made clear she was banking the sacrifice for later use. She would come tonight with Mrs. Petrakis, which Marigold had negotiated as her right, and Logan had not contested. Ava would come tonight too. He knew this because she'd told him 2 days ago, standing in the kitchen of the third-floor apartment they'd been moving into across the past 3 weeks. A slow, ongoing process that had required approximately 4 times as many trips to IKEA as Logan had budgeted for and had produced 2 spectacular arguments about shelving systems that had both ended the same way, with someone laughing and the other person trying not to. She'd said she would be there at 7, the opening hour, and he'd said okay, and she'd looked at him in that direct way she had and said, "You're allowed to be nervous." "I'm not nervous," he'd said. "You've reorganized the supply cabinet 3 times this week." He hadn't had a response to that. He was, in fact, nervous. Not the crisis fear of the eviction notice, not the mathematical dread of watching a bank balance approach zero. This was different. Smaller in some ways, and larger in others. This was the specific vulnerability of having made the best things he knew how to make and standing them up in a room and letting people look, and knowing that whatever happened next was out of his hands entirely. He'd lived with these 13 paintings for months. He knew every decision in them, the right ones and the wrong ones and the ones he still wasn't sure about. He knew which pieces had come easily and which had nearly broken him. He knew that 3 of them were better than anything he'd made before, and that 2 of them were merely good, and that the 13th was something he still didn't entirely understand, which Helen Park had told him was usually a sign. He stood in the finished gallery at 4 in the afternoon, the installation team packed up and gone, Helen in her office making calls, the space empty and quiet, and he walked through it slowly from the entrance to the back wall where the whole thing hung. Marigold's name, which Helen had used without modification when she printed the catalog because she'd found it more accurate than anything Logan had proposed. He stood in front of it for a while. He thought about the Tuesday evening with the red-bordered envelope and the $4.63. He thought about opening his door wider and saying, "Come inside, look," not because it was strategic or because he'd calculated what the gesture would produce, but because there was nothing else left to do, and the paintings were the truest thing he had. He thought about a woman stopping in front of a portrait of someone she didn't know and going still in a way that meant she knew her completely. He thought about the specific mercy of being seen accurately by another person, how rare that was, how much of ordinary life was spent being seen approximately, close enough to function, close enough to get through the day, but not quite. And then occasionally, without planning for it, someone looked at you the way Ava had looked at the portrait, the way Marigold looked at his new canvases in the morning light, and you understood for a moment that you were not only what your circumstances said you were. He turned and walked back toward the entrance. He had 3 hours before the show opened. He went home to change his shirt. The third-floor apartment still had the particular smell of recent moving, cardboard and fresh paint and the slightly displaced quality of a space that hadn't quite settled into being lived in yet. His art supplies were in the studio, properly organized now in the bigger room he'd always imagined having. Marigold's room was painted the specific shade of yellow-green she'd selected after a deliberation process that had taken 2 full weekends and involved paint swatches arranged on the wall in configurations that Logan could not follow, but which she had explained with great seriousness. The portrait of the woman in the garden hung in the hallway, between the front door and the living room. Ava had brought it over herself, 3 weeks ago, wrapped carefully in the kind of cloth a person uses when they understand what they're carrying. She'd hung it herself, too, stepping back twice to check the level with the focused attention of someone who wanted it right, not just up. She hadn't said much about it after it was on the wall. She'd stood looking at it for a moment and then turned and started talking about where the couch should go, which Logan had recognized as her way of moving through something without moving away from it. He hadn't pushed. He'd learned, in the months of getting to know her, that Ava processed the things that mattered most on her own time, in her own way, and that what she gave you when she was ready was always worth waiting for. He changed his shirt, charcoal, the one Marigold had approved back in November, which he now associated with things going better than expected, and stood at the hallway mirror for a moment. He looked like himself, tired in the way of someone who'd been working hard for 4 months and had arrived at the thing they'd been working toward. Not the circles tired Marigold had diagnosed in September, a different kind. He looked at the portrait beside the mirror. The woman in the garden, caught in her ordinary, irreplaceable moment. "Okay," he said to no one, or to her, and went to get his daughter. Marigold wore a dress she had selected with great conviction and paired with her red sneakers, which Logan had suggested might not match, and which she had overruled with the certainty of someone who'd already settled the question. Mrs. Petrakis wore her good coat and had brought flowers, which she presented to Logan at the door with a formality that moved him more than he showed. They arrived at 7:15. The gallery was already full. Not a crowd exactly. Helen Park's events ran toward curated rather than crowded. But the room had the alive quality of people genuinely engaged with the work, moving through it without the performative drift that sometimes substituted for attention at these things. Logan could see it from the entrance. People stopping, actually stopping, in front of specific pieces. He scanned the room. He found Ava before she found him. She was near the east wall, standing with Marcus Webb and a woman Logan didn't recognize looking at the Winter Park piece. She was wearing something deep red, which he'd never seen her wear before, and her hair was down the way it had been at the gathering, and she was listening to whatever Webb was saying with her head slightly tilted, the particular listening posture she had when she was being interested in something rather than polite about it. She looked up as though she'd felt him looking, which happened between them more often than he could explain. She didn't wave or gesture. She just held his gaze for a moment across the room, and in that moment there was something complete in it, an acknowledgement, a recognition, the specific look exchanged between two people who know where they've been and what it took to get to where they are. Then Webb said something, and she turned back, and Logan was intercepted by Helen Park's assistant, who needed him to meet someone, and the evening took over. He talked to more people in 4 hours than he could properly count. Gallery owners, collectors, a critic from a publication he'd read since graduate school, who asked pointed questions about influence and intentionality that Logan answered as honestly as he could without performing the honesty. A young painter, barely 25, nervous in the way of someone at their first event in a room like this, who stood in front of the lonely cold piece for a long time, and then asked Logan, very quietly, how he'd gotten the figure's weight right without making the sadness heavy. Logan thought about it. "I tried to paint what it feels like to be alone in public when you've chosen it," he said. "Not because you have to be, just because sometimes that's the one thing you can control." He paused. "The weight comes from the choosing, not the loneliness." The young painter looked at the piece and nodded, slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's it." Logan moved on, but he thought about that exchange for the rest of the evening. He found Marigold, at some point past 8, standing in front of the whole thing with her arms crossed in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, Ava's posture when she was looking at a painting seriously. He stood beside her. "Well," he said. "It's different in here," she said, "than in the studio." "How?" She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "In the studio it was yours. In here it's everybody's." She glanced up at him. "Is that okay?" He looked at the painting, the building, the light, the people suggested but not rendered, the whole scene pressing towards something not quite arrived. He thought about what it had meant to make it and what it would mean to let it go. "Yeah," he said. "That's kind of the whole point." Marigold nodded, satisfied. Then, "Two people were crying in front of the garden, Lady One." The portrait. They didn't know each other. They were just both there at the same time, and they both got... She made a gesture with her hands that meant moved. "Is that weird?" "No," Logan said. "That's not weird at all." She went back to Mrs. Petrakis, who was near the refreshments table, having what appeared to be a very animated conversation with a man in a bow tie. Logan watched her go and felt the thing that was sometimes almost too large to hold. The fact of her, this specific small person who had arrived in his life before he was remotely prepared for her and had made him into something better than he would have been on his own. He was thinking this when Ava appeared at his shoulder. "Webb wants 2 pieces, she said. "He hasn't told Helen yet. He's going to lowball the first offer. He does that, so don't let her accept it." "How do you know he wants 2? "Because he took photographs with his phone, and he only does that with pieces he's already decided on." She was standing beside him looking at the room, not at him. The critic from the Tribune, the one with the red scarf. She's going to write something. She was in front of the 13th piece for 11 minutes. I timed it. "You timed it?" She had a notebook. Logan looked at her profile. "Are you running this show or attending it?" She turned her head and looked at him. And there was that thing again. The nearly smile, the specific warmth she'd stopped working to contain. "I'm attending," she said. "I just pay attention." "You've been paying attention since the beginning." "Someone had to." He held her gaze. Around them the room moved and talked and looked at his work and formed opinions they would carry out into the city with them, and he was aware of all of it. The specific irreversibility of this evening, the way certain hours become the ones your life folds around. He'd had a few of those. The day Marigold was born, the day he understood his marriage was over, the Tuesday with the eviction notice. This was one of those hours. He knew it while it was happening, which was rarer than it sounded. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You've been thinking about it for a while." "How do you know?" "The supply cabinet thing was a symptom." He almost laughed. "I've been thinking about what you said on the front steps in November, that you'd watch people back away from the real thing and explain it to themselves as the practical decision." She was still. "I want to know if that happened to you," he said carefully. "Not with art. With something else." A long pause. The room continued around them, oblivious. "Yes," she said. "Once." She kept her eyes forward. "His name isn't important. We were 26, 27. He was building something real, a company, small, nothing like what I was doing, but genuine. He had the same quality you have." She paused. "That quality of people who make things that mean something because they can't figure out how to make things that mean nothing." "What happened?" "I was building too. I was in the middle of the hardest expansion I'd done, the one that became the portfolio I have now, and he wanted more of my time than I had, and I decided—" She stopped. "I told myself it was the wrong timing, that we were both too focused, that it was the practical decision." "Was it?" "I don't know," she said, with the honesty of someone who has stopped pretending to know. "I know I spent 2 years after that being very busy and very successful, and occasionally, at odd hours, understanding that I'd made a choice I couldn't entirely justify." She looked at him now. "And then I walked into an apartment full of paintings, and a man who said, 'Come inside, look,' and I thought something I didn't have a clean sentence for." "What was it?" She was quiet for a moment. "That some things arrive on their own schedule regardless of whether you've made room for them." A pause. "That you can be very competent and very careful and still miss the thing that was actually the point." The room was loud enough around them that the conversation existed in its own quiet. Logan looked at her. The woman who had walked into his apartment 4 months ago with a leather portfolio and the intention of collecting on a debt, and had instead done something neither of them had planned for or could have scheduled. Who had stood in front of a portrait and let her face tell the truth. Who had said you needed someone to stop counting, and I'm working on the rest of the answer, and ask first this time. All the incomplete sentences of two people finding each other in the honest, imperfect, unarchitectured way. "I painted you," he said. "I should tell you that." She blinked. "Which one?" "It's not here. I didn't include it in the show." He paused. "It's the street scene. The one at dusk. You're not in it as you... It's not a portrait, but it has your quality. The one where you're holding everything close because you learned to and haven't fully learned when to stop." She was very still. "I should have asked first," he said. "I know." The silence between them had a texture to it, not uncomfortable but full. The kind of silence that means something is being understood rather than avoided. "Can I see it?" she said finally. "Whenever you want." She nodded slowly. Then, "Is it good?" "It might be the best thing I've ever made." She pressed her lips together and looked away, back toward the room, and he watched her gather herself in the particular way she did, not shutting down, just settling, finding ground. "Logan." Her voice was quiet. "Yeah. I'm glad I knocked on your door." He thought about the red-bordered envelope, the flickering fluorescent hallway, the $4.63. The moment he'd pulled the paintings out and stood them in the light of the living room without fully knowing why. "I'm glad I opened it," he said. No. The show ran for 3 weeks. By the end of the first week, 9 of the 13 pieces had sold. Webb had made his lowball offer on 2 pieces, Helen had held firm, and he'd come back at the number Logan had set without further negotiation. The critic with the red scarf published a review that ran on a Tuesday, a Thursday piece in a Tuesday publication, which was its own kind of timing, and used the phrase quietly devastating twice, which Logan found both flattering and slightly alarming. By the end of the second week, all 13 pieces had sold. Helen called him about a waiting list for the next show, a concept that still sat in him as something almost abstract. The idea of a next show, of this being not a single event but a pattern, a career, the main entrance he'd been living in the side door of for 8 years. Marcus Webb, who had acquired the street scene and the Winter Park piece, called Logan directly on a Thursday afternoon to say that he'd been telling people about the work and that 3 of those people would be in touch, and to expect calls from gallery representatives in San Francisco and Chicago. Logan wrote this down on the back of a grocery receipt because it was what was nearest, and folded it into his wallet. Dex saw the review and called to say he wanted that lobby piece earlier than discussed. Could they talk numbers? Logan said yes, and the number Logan named made Dex quiet for a moment before he said, "Fair enough." Helen Park began conversations about a show in New York the following autumn, and mentioned, with the studied casualness of someone making a large statement in a small voice, that she'd had interest from a gallery in London who'd seen the catalog images. Logan processed all of this the way he processed most large things, incompletely, in pieces, while doing something else. He was stretching new canvases in the studio when the London possibility landed in his phone. He stood for a moment looking at the blank white rectangle in front of him, and then he picked up a pencil and made the first mark. Tim. On the last Saturday of the show's run, he brought Marigold back for a second visit. She'd been twice already, but this was different. The show's last weekend, most pieces with small red dots indicating sale, the space carrying the particular feeling of an ending that has been earned. Marigold walked through slowly, more slowly than a child usually walked through anything, and stopped at the pieces she'd named and looked at them with the proprietary affection of someone who'd been present at the beginning. She stopped longest in front of the portrait section. Helen had placed the portrait of the woman in the garden, the one Logan had never included in any official inventory because it was not for sale and never would be. Not as part of the show itself, but as a single piece in the entry corridor, unlabeled, with no price and no availability. Just there. Present. A woman in a garden, caught in a moment of being simply herself. Helen had asked permission to display it. Logan had asked Ava. Ava had said yes, after a silence that told him what the painting meant to her without requiring any additional information. Marigold stood in front of it now, looking up. "This one's my favorite," she said. "I know. It's not sad. No. It's like," she searched for it, "like when something was hard and now it isn't. And you know it wasn't easy to get there, but you got there anyway." Logan looked at the portrait, the woman in the garden, the particular quality of afternoon light on her face, the expression that existed somewhere between joy and peace. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly it." Marigold reached up and took his hand, which she still did sometimes without ceremony. The same full-body grabbing of the person she trusted most, though now it was just a hand, just his hand in hers. They stood there together in the corridor for a moment. The gallery was quiet on Saturday afternoon. The end of things. The particular stillness that comes when something has run its full length and arrived at itself. Ava was at the apartment when they got back. She had a key now, which had happened without a formal conversation about it. Logan had simply left a spare on the kitchen counter one morning, and she'd picked it up the next time she came over, and neither of them had made it a thing, because it wasn't a thing, it was just what it was. She was in the kitchen when they came in, had apparently attempted to make coffee, and had produced something that Logan would later describe as technically coffee, in the same way that a collapsed building is technically architecture. Marigold inspected it and said, "I'll make toast," with the decisive energy of someone redirecting a bad situation. Ava looked at Logan over Marigold's head with the expression of someone who has been found out. "You can run 3 investment funds and you can't make coffee," Logan said. "I'm a high-functioning person in a very specific set of domains," she said. "The coffee is your blind spot." "I have several blind spots." She held his gaze. "I'm working on them." Marigold made toast and they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, in the late afternoon light of a Saturday in March, the city doing its Saturday things outside the window. The horse calendar was still on the refrigerator. A new one now, different horses, same marigold aesthetic. And the eviction notice was long gone, but the drawing of Logan was still there, tacked beside a new addition. A drawing Marigold had done of all three of them standing in the hallway of the third-floor apartment. Three figures of varying heights, the tallest with circles under his eyes, and the second tallest holding a coffee cup with an X through it, and the smallest one with her name written in a circle above her head like a halo she'd given herself. Logan had looked at that drawing the first morning it appeared and had experienced something difficult to name. The particular feeling of a life reorganizing itself around what was actually real, not the life you'd planned or the one you'd defended or the one you'd been trying to hold together with math and fear, but the one that had arrived while you were doing other things, the one that turned out to be better than what you'd been protecting so hard. He wasn't naive about it. He knew that Ava was still learning to let things be imperfect, and that she would sometimes retreat behind the professional distance because it was the muscle she'd built for 25 years, and it wouldn't unlearn quickly. He knew that his own history, the divorce, the years of managing alone, the calcified habit of not asking for more than the bare minimum from the world, had left its marks too, the kind that didn't disappear but that you learned to work with. He knew that Marigold would always be the most important thing in any room he was in, and that this was a fact Ava understood and had accepted, and that her acceptance of it was one of the truest things he knew about her. He knew the practical things too, that his career was growing in ways that still surprised him, that the financial terror of the eviction notice had been replaced by a more manageable uncertainty, that the second bedroom had become a studio, that the studio had become the center of the apartment, that the apartment had become something he was no longer afraid to lose. He knew that more was coming, more work, more difficulty, more things he couldn't anticipate, and that none of it would be as smooth as it looked from the outside, because nothing real ever was. But he also knew something he hadn't known 7 months ago, standing in the hallway under the flickering fluorescent light with a red-bordered envelope in his hand. He knew that the worst moments of your life, the ones that arrive on a Tuesday and feel like endings, are not always endings. Sometimes they are the specific door that opens into the rest of it. Not because things always work out, not because the universe arranges itself toward happy outcomes, but because occasionally you are standing in exactly the right disaster at exactly the right time, and you have the presence of mind to open the door when someone knocks, and to say, "Come inside, look." And someone comes inside, and they look. And what they see is not what you expected them to see. It's what you actually are. The paintings stacked against every wall, the horse calendar, the circles under your eyes, the daughter asleep down the hall, the $4 in the bank, the 8 years of work you'd been treating like a side door when it was always the main entrance. And it turns out that's enough. More than enough. It turns out that was everything. That evening, after Marigold had been put to bed and the apartment had settled into its night quiet, Logan went to the studio. It was a habit now. The late hour, the lamp, the canvas. And Ava had learned to read it as the thing it was. Not distance, just the pull of the work. The way some people need an hour at the end of the day to remember who they are before sleep. She was reading on the couch when he went in. He came back 2 hours later with paint on his hands, and she looked up and said, "Good?" And he said, "Yeah." And she went back to her book. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the city doing what cities do at midnight, moving, lit, indifferent, and miraculous in equal measure. He thought about a young painter at the opening, asking how he'd gotten the weight right without making the sadness heavy. He thought about his answer, that the weight comes from the choosing, not the loneliness, and realized it was true of more than paintings. Everything you carry, you chose. And everything you set down, you chose too. And sometimes on a Tuesday that becomes the day the calendar folds around, you open a door and choose to let someone see you clearly. That's all it was. That was the whole thing. He turned off the kitchen light and went back to the living room, and he sat beside her on the couch in the easy, unguarded quiet of two people who have stopped pretending the distance is necessary. And outside the window, the city held everything it held. All the ordinary Tuesdays and the red-bordered envelopes and the people standing in hallways under flickering lights, counting what they have left. And in the apartment on the third floor of the Callaway Arms, for now, for this hour, everything was exactly where it belonged.